There comes a moment in the life of every believer when the silence of their own spirit should disturb them more than the noise of the world. A moment when they must look into the mirror of their faith and ask a difficult question. Have I been living the faith I claim to believe, or have I simply been repeating words that sound holy while my heart grows comfortable? Because faith was never meant to be a decoration you wear on the outside. It was never meant to be something you display for a few hours and then quietly place back on the shelf when life becomes inconvenient. Faith is not a slogan, it is not a routine, it is not a label. Faith is a living force that demands movement. But too many believers today have allowed their faith to fall asleep in the comfort of familiarity. They know the language of belief, they know the songs, they know the traditions, yet knowing is not the same as living. Agreement is not the same as obedience, and that is where the danger begins. Because when faith becomes nothing more than words, it slowly loses its power. Words without action are like thunder without lightning, loud, but without impact. A believer who speaks about truth but never stands for it eventually becomes comfortable with silence. And silence has never changed a broken world. Look around you. The world is not lacking opinions. It is not lacking noise. What it is lacking is conviction, people who believe something deeply enough to live it boldly. Believers were never called to be spectators watching the world drift further into confusion. They were called to be builders of hope, carriers of truth, voices of courage when fear tries to control the conversation. But that cannot happen if faith stays locked inside words. Faith must walk. Faith must act. Faith must step forward even when the ground feels uncertain. Because real belief always produces movement. It produces courage when courage is required. It produces compassion when compassion is needed. It produces strength when weakness tries to take over. A believer who truly understands their faith cannot remain passive while the world around them struggles for direction. Something inside them rises up. Something refuses to remain quiet, not because they seek attention, but because truth has a voice and believers were meant to carry it. This is the moment where spiritual complacency must end. The moment where believers stop being comfortable observers and start becoming active witnesses of the faith they claim to hold. Because a sleeping faith changes nothing, but a living faith, one that moves, speaks, stands, and acts, has the power to awaken hearts, restore hope, and remind a restless world that truth is still alive. And if we are honest for a moment, the greatest threat to faith has never truly been the noise of the world. It has never been critics, skeptics, or those who openly oppose belief. History proves that faith often grows stronger when it is challenged from the outside. Pressure has a way of purifying conviction. Opposition has a way of strengthening those who truly believe. The real danger begins somewhere much quieter. It begins when believers themselves grow comfortable, when the urgency of faith fades into routine, when conviction slowly gives way to convenience, because spiritual laziness does not arrive suddenly. It creeps in slowly, almost unnoticed. It whispers that passion is no longer necessary. It convinces people that simply identifying as a believer is enough, even if the fire of that belief has grown cold. And before long, faith becomes something people talk about rather than something they live. A person can attend gatherings, repeat sacred words, and still allow their spiritual life to drift into autopilot. They can appear faithful on the outside, while the hunger for truth on the inside slowly disappears. That is the quiet danger, because when believers stop growing, stop seeking, stop standing, something begins to fade. The courage that once defined their faith becomes hesitation. The boldness that once lifted their voice becomes silence. And silence is where compromise begins to grow. The world does not become stronger simply because it is loud. It becomes stronger when believers who carry truth stop using their voice. Darkness does not advance because it is powerful. It advances because light sometimes grows tired. But faith was never meant to grow tired. Faith was meant to remain awake, alert, alive. It was meant to challenge complacency and refuse the comfort of indifference. A living faith does not settle for the minimum. It continues to seek wisdom, continues to pursue truth, continues to grow stronger with every challenge it faces. That is why spiritual laziness is so dangerous. Not because it looks dramatic, but because it looks harmless. It disguises itself as comfort. It disguises itself as routine. It convinces people that they are doing enough when deep down they know they have stopped pressing forward. But faith was never designed to stand still. It moves, it grows. It sharpens the spirit and strengthens the heart. It pushes believers to rise above fear, to rise above apathy, and to remember that belief is not just something you possess. It is something you practice. And the moment believers shake off that spiritual laziness, the moment they refuse to settle for passive belief, something powerful begins to happen. Their faith becomes alive again, their courage returns, their voice becomes clear, because a believer who refuses to grow lazy in their faith becomes impossible for darkness to ignore. And when faith truly awakens inside a believer, something powerful begins to rise within them, a courage that refuses to bow to pressure. Because real faith does not hide when truth is challenged. Real faith does not step back when the world demands silence. It stands throughout history. Truth has always faced resistance. Every generation has seen moments when the easiest path was to remain quiet, to avoid conflict, to blend in with the voices around them. And many people choose that path because it feels safe. Silence often feels safer than standing alone. But faith was never designed for comfort. Faith was designed for courage. There will always be moments when the world pushes believers to soften their convictions, to dilute their beliefs, to keep their faith private so that no one feels uncomfortable. The pressure may come through culture, through public opinion, through the fear of rejection or criticism. And in those moments, every believer faces a choice. Not a comfortable choice, a defining choice. Will they stand firmly for what they believe, or will they slowly step back into silence? Because standing for truth has never been easy, it requires strength of character, it requires clarity of conviction. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood by people who may not share the same values. But courage has always separated living faith from passive belief. A believer who truly understands their calling cannot remain silent when truth is questioned or pushed aside. Not out of arrogance, not out of anger, but out of conviction. Because when something is true, it carries a responsibility. Truth was never meant to be hidden in fear. Look at the world today. There are countless voices speaking loudly about many things. Opinions, ideas, arguments that shift with the wind of culture. Yet in the middle of that noise, the voice of truth often grows quiet because believers hesitate. They hesitate because they fear criticism. They hesitate because they fear standing alone. They hesitate because the cost of conviction can feel heavy. But faith was never built on convenience. Faith was built on the willingness to stand even when standing is difficult. When believers choose courage over silence, something remarkable happens. Their presence becomes a reminder that truth still has defenders. Their voice becomes a signal that conviction still exists in a world full of uncertainty. And courage has a way of spreading. One person who stands firmly often inspires another to do the same. One voice speaking truth can awaken courage in hearts that were once hesitant. But it always begins with someone who refuses to surrender their conviction. Someone who understands that belief is not just about what you hold in your heart, but what you are willing to stand for in the open. Because the world has never been changed by silent conviction. It has always been changed by believers who carried their faith with courage and refused to let truth disappear into the shadows. And there is another quiet danger that slowly creeps into the life of many believers, a danger that does not look threatening at first. It comes wrapped in routine, dressed in tradition, and surrounded by familiar words. It is the danger of comfortable religion. Comfortable religion is easy. It asks very little. It fits neatly into a schedule, stays within predictable boundaries, and never demands too much from the heart. It allows people to participate without ever being transformed. A person can sit through countless gatherings, hear powerful messages, sing meaningful songs, and yet walk away unchanged. The motions are there, the language is there, the appearance is there, but the fire that once made faith alive begins to fade. And when passion fades, faith slowly turns into habit. Habit can look faithful on the outside, it can look organized, disciplined, and respectable. But habit without conviction is like a lamp with a dim flame. It exists, but it does not illuminate much of anything. Belief was never meant to become routine. Faith was meant to ignite something inside the soul. It was meant to stir the conscience, challenge the heart, and awaken a deep sense of purpose. It was meant to push believers beyond comfort and into action. But comfortable religion resists that movement. It prefers stability over transformation. It prefers predictability over passion. It allows people to feel satisfied without ever feeling challenged. And the moment faith stops challenging the heart, it begins losing its strength. Because true belief carries energy. It carries urgency. It carries a sense that life has meaning beyond routine, and that every moment carries an opportunity to live with courage, compassion, and conviction. When that passion is alive, faith becomes something vibrant. It influences decisions. It shapes character. It inspires people to stand for truth and extend kindness even when the world becomes harsh. But when faith becomes comfortable, it stops stretching the spirit. It stops stirring the heart. It becomes something people manage instead of something that transforms them. And the tragedy is that many believers do not notice when this shift happens. It occurs slowly, quietly, over time. The excitement that once filled their spirit becomes familiarity. The urgency that once drove their actions becomes occasional thought. But deep within every believer there remains a spark waiting to be stirred again, because faith was never designed to stay comfortable. It was designed to awaken the soul, to challenge complacency, and to remind believers that their purpose is far greater than simply maintaining a routine. When that passion returns, when belief once again burns with conviction, comfortable religion disappears, and living faith rises in its place, ready to move, to grow, and to shine in a world that desperately needs light. And this is where the calling of a believer becomes unmistakably clear. Believers were never meant to disappear into the background of the world. They were never meant to blend quietly into the same confusion that surrounds everyone else. They were called to be light. Light does not hide. Light does not apologize for shining. Light exists for one reason: to push back the darkness. Yet one of the greatest temptations believers face today is the pressure to blend in. The world often rewards conformity. It encourages people to soften their convictions, to keep their beliefs private, to avoid standing out in ways that might invite criticism or disagreement. But light that blends into darkness stops being light. A believer who carries truth cannot allow their convictions to fade just to fit comfortably into the environment around them. Because the very purpose of light is to create contrast. It reveals what cannot be seen in the dark. It provides direction when everything else looks uncertain. And the darker the night becomes, the more valuable the light becomes. Look around at the world today. Many people are searching for direction. They are searching for something stable in the middle of confusion. They are searching for hope in a time where fear often dominates the conversation. But hope cannot be found in shadows. Hope is found where light exists. That is why believers were given such a powerful responsibility. Their lives are meant to reflect something different, something steady, something courageous, something rooted in truth rather than shifting opinions. This does not mean standing with arrogance or hostility. Light does not attack darkness, it simply shines. And by shining, it changes the environment around it. When a believer lives with integrity in a dishonest world, that is light. When a believer speaks truth in a moment where silence would have been easier, that is light. When a believer shows compassion where bitterness would have been expected, that is light. And every act of light pushes darkness back just a little further. But that only happens when believers refuse to blend in. Because blending into darkness may feel comfortable, but it erases the very difference that faith was meant to create. A believer's life was never meant to look identical to the patterns of the world around them. It was meant to reflect a different standard, a different source of strength, a different kind of hope. And when people encounter that kind of light, something begins to change, confusion starts to clear, fear starts to lose its grip. Hearts begin to realize that there is another way to live. That is the quiet power of light. It does not need to shout. It does not need to force itself into every conversation. Its presence alone begins to transform the space around it. But the moment believers hide that light, the world loses one more source of hope, which is why the call is so clear. Do not blend into the darkness. Shine where you are. Stand where truth is needed. Let your life reflect the kind of light that reminds a searching world that darkness has never been the final answer. And if you study history carefully, you begin to notice a pattern that repeats itself in every generation. There always comes a moment when people of faith are faced with a defining choice. Not a small decision, not a comfortable preference, but a moment where the direction of their conviction is tested. Every generation reaches a crossroads where compromise begins to look easier than conviction. Compromise often arrives quietly. It does not usually appear as a dramatic surrender of belief. Instead, it whispers small suggestions. It encourages people to soften their stance just a little, to adjust their values just enough to avoid tension, to shift their priorities in ways that make life smoother and more acceptable in the eyes of others. And at first, those adjustments may seem harmless, but compromise has a way of growing. What begins as a small silence can slowly become a habit of avoiding truth altogether. What begins as a minor adjustment can gradually reshape a person's entire sense of right and wrong. Over time, conviction begins to fade, replaced by whatever feels most convenient in the moment. That is why every generation eventually faces a test. Will they protect their convictions, or will they allow them to slowly dissolve under pressure? The world has always applied pressure. Culture changes, ideas shift. Public opinion rises and falls like waves in the ocean. But truth was never meant to rise and fall with those waves. Truth was meant to stand firm, and believers were meant to be the people who hold that ground when everything else begins to shift. But holding that ground requires courage. It requires clarity. It requires the willingness to say, "This is what I believe, and I will not abandon it simply because the crowd has chosen another direction." That kind of conviction has always shaped history. Every time a generation chooses conviction over compromise, something powerful happens. Values are preserved. Truth remains visible. The next generation inherits a foundation strong enough to stand on. But when compromise replaces conviction, the opposite begins to unfold. Standards weaken. Direction becomes unclear. People begin drifting without the steady compass that conviction once provided. That is why these moments matter so deeply, because the decisions believers make today will echo far beyond their own lives. They will influence families, communities, and generations yet to come. Conviction is not just about personal belief. It is about preserving truth so that others can still find it. And the world will always test that conviction. It will question it, it will challenge it, sometimes it will even mock it. But conviction that survives pressure becomes stronger. It becomes a steady voice in a noisy world. It becomes a reminder that truth does not need popularity to remain true. And when believers choose conviction in the face of compromise, they do more than protect their faith. They become anchors of stability in a world that is constantly shifting, proving that some foundations are strong enough to endure every storm. And this is where the true measure of belief begins to show itself, not in the moments when faith is easy, but in the ordinary days of life when no one is watching, when there is no crowd, no spotlight, no applause. Because a genuine believer does not live their faith only in sacred moments. Faith was never meant to exist for just a few hours in a gathering, and then disappear when real life begins. Faith was meant to walk into every part of life. It was meant to shape how a person thinks, how they speak, how they treat others, how they respond when life becomes difficult. But one of the quiet struggles many believers face is separating faith from everyday life. They allow belief to exist in certain spaces, moments of worship, moments of reflection, but when the week begins and responsibilities rise, faith slowly moves to the background. And when faith stays in the background, it stops influencing the choices that truly define a person's character. A living faith does not remain hidden until a special occasion. It moves into the ordinary routines of life. It shows itself in patience when frustration would be easier. It appears in honesty when dishonesty might offer a quick advantage. It becomes visible in kindness when the world around you feels cold and indifferent. This is where faith becomes real. Not just in the words people speak, but in the way they live when those words are tested. Anyone can claim belief when circumstances are comfortable. But genuine faith continues to guide a person when life becomes demanding, when pressure builds, when the easier path would be to forget the principles they claim to hold. That is why everyday life becomes the proving ground of belief. The decisions made in quiet moments often reveal more about a person's faith than the words spoken in public moments. The way someone treats a stranger, the way they respond to disappointment, the way they carry integrity when no reward is offered. These are the places where belief becomes visible. And when a believer lives their faith daily, something powerful begins to happen. Their life itself becomes a message. People may never hear a speech, never attend a gathering, never read a single line of sacred text, but they will notice character. They will notice consistency. They will notice when someone carries a sense of peace, purpose, and integrity that stands apart from the confusion around them. That quiet consistency speaks louder than many words, because faith that lives in everyday actions becomes undeniable. It becomes something people can see, something they can feel, something that challenges them to wonder what source of strength allows a person to live with that kind of steadiness. And that is exactly how belief was meant to function. Not confined to moments of worship, but alive in the rhythm of daily life, guiding every step, shaping every decision, and quietly proving that true faith is not something a person visits occasionally. It is something they live every single day. And this is the moment where responsibility comes into sharp focus. Faith is not merely something you hold in your heart. It is something you carry into the world. Every believer has been given a calling far greater than comfort or convenience. And with that calling comes responsibility. Responsibility to influence, to inspire, to act. Responsibility to refuse the pull of apathy, the ease of silence, and the temptation to stay hidden. because the world is full of uncertainty, full of fear, full of people who have lost hope. And faith that does not move, faith that does not engage, does nothing to change that reality. Believers were never meant to be passive observers. They were meant to be the ones who stand in the gap, who speak truth when falsehood rises, who shine light where darkness lingers. That is the weight of responsibility. They are entrusted with a mission that transcends personal comfort. And responsibility is not always comfortable. It asks believers to act when others remain silent. It asks them to make difficult choices, to confront injustice, to carry courage into places where fear dominates. It asks them to be unwavering when everyone else drifts with the current. But responsibility also awakens purpose. It reminds the believer that life is not a rehearsal. Every decision, every action, every word has potential to touch someone, to guide someone, to spark change. A believer who embraces responsibility understands that their faith is not for themselves alone. It is for the world around them. And when believers step fully into this responsibility, something remarkable begins to happen. They stop waiting for someone else to act. They stop looking for permission or approval. They rise and become the agents of change that their faith calls them to be. Every choice to act faithfully becomes a ripple that spreads beyond the moment. Every refusal to compromise strengthens the foundation for others to follow. Every act of courage, no matter how small, becomes a statement that faith still matters. Because the truth is clear, the world will not change by accident. Darkness will not retreat on its own. Hope will not be restored without believers who understand the responsibility they carry and are willing to live it fully, boldly, and without apology. And that is what separates a faith that sleeps from a faith that moves mountains. Believers who embrace their responsibility and allow their faith to shape the world around them. And let me be clear about this: fear and silence are the silent killers of faith. They do not announce themselves with warning signs. They creep in slowly, convincing believers that it is safer to remain quiet, to shrink back, to hide the power of their convictions from the world. Fear whispers, "Stay comfortable, avoid confrontation, do not make waves." And too often, believers listen. Silence answers the call of convenience. It assures them that peace is preferable to courage. It tells them that keeping their faith private will protect them from criticism or discomfort. But faith was never meant to be timid. Faith was never meant to fold in the face of pressure. Faith was never meant to whisper when it should roar. The greatest victories, the greatest movements of God's people have always risen from boldness, not timidity. They have always been led by voices that refused to be silenced, by hearts that refused to let fear dictate their actions. A believer who allows fear to guide their steps begins to live a faith that is powerless. Silence left unchecked becomes a breeding ground for compromise, for doubt, for the slow erosion of conviction. And the world around them begins to notice the absence of courage. Darkness begins to gain ground, not because it is stronger, but because light refused to shine. But when believers confront fear, when they refuse to let silence dominate their actions, something extraordinary happens. Their faith becomes a force that cannot be ignored. Their voice cuts through confusion, their courage inspires action, and their life becomes proof that truth is stronger than intimidation. Every act of boldness, every refusal to remain silent, is a declaration that faith will not be passive. It is a reminder that the power of belief is not in quiet words alone, but in visible, fearless action that challenges the world around it. Because the difference between powerless belief and powerful faith is courage. The difference between fading light and shining hope is refusal to be silent. The difference between darkness winning and truth prevailing lies in whether believers are willing to confront fear and speak boldly, even when the world trembles in uncertainty. And that courage is contagious. One believer who refuses to remain silent can awaken dozens, even hundreds, to remember that fear does not have the final word. Faith does. And here is the truth that every believer must grasp with both hands. When faith wakes up, when it refuses to stay silent, when it chooses courage over comfort, it does more than survive. It transforms the world. Darkness does not need strength to spread. It only needs light to sleep. But when believers awaken fully, when they rise with conviction, courage, and unshakable faith, darkness loses ground. Awakened faith does not simply endure circumstances, it reshapes them. It brings hope where despair has taken root. It inspires hearts that had given up. It reminds a restless, confused world that truth still exists and that love still has power. Every decision to act boldly, every refusal to compromise, every stand taken in the face of fear creates ripples far beyond what the believer can see. And understand this, transformation is never the result of passive belief. The world is full of ideas, speeches, and opinions, but ideas alone cannot change hearts. Only living, active faith, faith that walks into the marketplace, into classrooms, into offices, into homes, and into the public square, can pierce darkness with light. The awakened believer becomes a carrier of hope, a beacon of courage, a voice that challenges apathy, and a reminder that God's truth is unstoppable. One heart fully ignited by faith can inspire many others to rise. One life surrendered to purpose can awaken communities. One generation that refuses to sleep can reshape the future. And the moment believers realize the power they carry, the moment they understand that their faith is not for decoration but for action, the atmosphere itself begins to change. People notice, lives are touched, the hopeless see a path, the confused find direction, the weak are strengthened. Do not underestimate the difference one awakened believer can make. History has proven this over and over. It is never the crowds, never the popular opinion, never the numbers alone that change the course of nations. It is the people who refuse to sleep, who refuse to compromise, who refuse to let fear silence them. That is the ultimate wake-up call. Faith that awakens transforms not only the believer, but everything and everyone within reach. Darkness will always rise, chaos will always swirl, but an awakened believer stands as a living declaration that hope is stronger than despair, courage is louder than fear, and truth is more powerful than lies. And when believers rise together, refusing to drift with the currents of indifference, refusing to blend into the shadows, the world begins to see that faith is not just a private matter. It is a force that changes history. So hear this clearly. The call has been sounded, and the time to sleep has passed. Every believer faces a choice: remain comfortable and silent, or rise fully awake and let faith take action. The world will not wait, and darkness will not pause. But a believer who awakens, who chooses courage over fear, conviction over compromise, action over apathy, becomes a force that cannot be ignored. Light that refuses to be hidden dispels the shadows. Hope that refuses to surrender inspires a generation. And faith that moves boldly transforms everything it touches. This is your moment to rise, to stand, to shine, and to live a faith so alive that it shakes the world and changes history.